The Frontier Diplomatic Station orbited a neutron star because apparently someone in the Galactic Administrative Collective thought impressive view was worth the constant radiation shielding maintenance. It was the kind of decision that screamed committee compromise, close enough to contested space to matter, far enough from anything comfortable to ensure nobody wanted to stay long, perfect for processing the endless parade of species petitioning for trade agreements, resource rights, and the occasional plea to not be conquered by their neighbors. The station's current administrator, a Vithrani named Yilix, whose carapace bore the scars of 4 decades in bureaucratic warfare, stood in the observation deck watching the latest shuttle approach. His compound eyes tracked the vessel with the weary attention of someone who'd seen 10,000 arrivals and expected nothing interesting from number 10,001. Confirmation on the petitioner. He clicked to his assistant, a floating ephemeral whose gaseous form shimmered with bioluminescent impatience. Human. Solo envoy. Dization diplomatic courier with provisional speaking rights. The ephemeral's translation matrix rendered the information in flat, disinterested tone. They're requesting audience for Earth's formal application to the Colonial Exchange Program. Yilix's mandibles twitched. The Vithrani equivalent of a long-suffering sigh. Human. The galaxy's latest additions to the ever-expanding catalog of species who thought they were ready for interstellar politics. They'd made contact roughly 3 standard cycles ago, had barely established 2 off-world settlements, and were already angling for the resources that came with Colonial Exchange membership. Ambitious little creatures. Biometric scan? He asked, though he already knew what it would show. Humans were depressingly standard for Class C carbon-based life forms. Completed during approach. Bank specimen appears female by their dimorphic standards. The ephemeral pulled up a holographic display that made Yilix's secondary heart sink. Baseline analysis: calcium-based internal structure, single cardiovascular system, limited natural armor, no defensive modifications whatsoever. Gravity tolerance, 0.8 to 1.2 standard. Temperature range, laughably narrow. Chemical sensitivity extensive. The display highlighted the human's body and wireframe, helpfully marking every vulnerable point in pulsing red. There were a lot of them. The skeletal structure looked like it would shatter if you looked at it wrong. Thin calcium deposits wrapped around soft organs with nothing but a membrane and some muscles for protection. One cardiovascular system, singular. If that failed, the whole organism just stopped. Threat assessment, Yilix asked, though the question was pure protocol. Negligible. Species classification suggests extreme fragility. Recommend environmental control set to cushioned parameters, and assignment of protective detail. Of course, the collective's insurance actuaries must have been screaming. If something happened to a petitioner species on a Jack station, the paperwork alone could end careers, and humans, based on this scan, looked like they could be injured by a stern conversation. Yilix authorized the docking with 4 separate emergency medical teams on standby and environmental controls that would make a nursery seem harsh. The gravity plating was adjusted to 0.85 standard, gentle enough that the human wouldn't strain that pathetic skeleton. Atmospheric composition was filtered to remove anything potentially irritating. Temperature was set to what the database listed as human comfort range, which was apparently so specific that a 3-degree variance could cause distress. Deploy escort unit Gamma, Yilix ordered. Full protective detail. If this creature so much as stumbles, I want it caught before it hits the deck. The shuttle docked with the gentle precision reserved for transporting volatile explosives. Through the observation window, Yilix watched as the airlock cycled and the human emerged. She was small. That was the first thought. Barely reached standard chest height on a Vithrani, and Vithrani weren't exactly known as the galaxy's giant. She wore what appeared to be formal attire by human standards, some kind of dark fabric ensemble that covered most of her frame, and carried a single data case. Her face was smooth, unmarked by the scarring or modification that most civilized species use to denote rank. Dark hair pulled back in a simple configuration. Eyes that swept the docking bay with what Yilix's cultural database unhelpfully labeled as professional assessment. Escort Unit Gamma, 6 heavily armed Burlathi, whose species prided themselves on protection contracts, moved to surround her with the careful coordination of professionals handling something precious and breakable. Their leader, a scarred veteran whose name translated roughly to "he who prevents bad things," activated his translator and rumbled something in what he clearly thought was a soothing tone. The human's expression didn't change, but Ulix's decades of reading body language across 100 species caught something in the slight tension around her eyes. Amusement? Exasperation? The database wasn't clear on human micro-expression. She responded in clear, unaccented standard, which was impressive given that humans had only had 3 cycles to learn it. Thank you for the escort, but I'm capable of walking unassisted. Protocol requires protective detail for high-risk biological profiles. He who prevents bad things explained, his tone carrying the patience of someone addressing a child. Your species parameters indicate significant environmental vulnerabilities. We are here to ensure your safety. How considerate, the human said, and there was definitely something in her voice that the translator wasn't quite capturing. She began walking toward the main corridor, and the Berlothi formation shifted around her like she was a head of state in a war zone. Ulix watched the procession through the station's security feeds, noting the way his staff members stopped to stare. Several ephemeral floated closer out of curiosity before being waved off by security. A cluster of Xthuri traders actually took images, probably the first human they'd seen in person, and humans did have that novel appearance that some species found interesting. All soft curves and symmetrical features, without any of the useful additions like sensory antennae or chemical defense glands. Administrator, his assistant chimed. The human is requesting to proceed directly to the formal audience chamber. She's declining the offer of rest cycle accommodation. Declined. After a multi-day shuttle journey, Ulix's mandibles clicked in surprise. Her biological readings must be in distress. Negative. All readings nominal. She appears completely fine. That seemed unlikely given the distance traveled in what amounted to a tin can with engines. But humans were new enough that their tolerances might not be properly catalogued yet. Ulix authorized the audience and made his way to the formal chamber, a space designed to impress petitioners with the collective's might and grandeur. Holographic displays showed the territories of the collective's 800-member species. The ceiling arched high enough to accommodate even the largest representatives. Everything about it screamed, "You are small and we are vast." The human entered flanked by her protective detail, and Ulix had to suppress the instinct to treat this like a daycare pickup. She looked impossibly fragile standing there in the cavernous space, surrounded by guards who could probably each bench press a small vehicle. "Welcome, human envoy," Ulix began, his translator rendering his clicks and chirrups into formal standard. "Earth's petition for colonial exchange membership has been received. However, I must inform you that the preliminary assessment raises significant concerns." "Concerns?" the human asked, her tone professionally neutral. "Your species profile indicates extreme environmental sensitivity and limited defensive capabilities. The colonial exchange program involves establishing settlements in frontier territories where support infrastructure is minimal. Frankly, the risk assessment suggests humans would require more protective resources than any current member species." Ulix gestured to a display showing Earth's biometric data. "You lack natural armor, redundant organ systems, atmospheric adaptability, radiation resistance, regenerative capabilities, venom production, dimensional phasing or any of the standard survival modifications we see in successful colonial species." The human was quiet for a moment, and Ulix couldn't read the expression on her face. The translator's emotional analysis kept flickering between classifications. "I see," she finally said. "So you're denying Earth's application based on our apparent fragility." "It's not a denial, it's a recommendation for further development. Perhaps in another century or two, once your species has implemented some basic biological improvements, we can revisit." The station's alert klaxons cut him off mid-sentence, and every display in the chamber switched to emergency. The thing about frontier diplomatic stations was that their locations made them targets. Not often. Most species understood that attacking a galactic administrative collective facility was a spectacularly bad idea, but sometimes a species desperate or arrogant enough would try anyway. The Drevkith, as it turned out, were both. The attack happened with the kind of efficiency that suggested planning. 3 warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel already firing, their weapons chewing through the station's outer defensive grid before the automated systems could even properly identify the threat. The Drevkith were a relatively new hostile force in this sector, insectoid, aggressive and apparently convinced that the station's proximity to their breeding grounds constituted an act of war. Ulix's carapace plates flared in alarm as damage reports cascaded across his neural link. Hull breaches on decks 7 through 12. Primary shields at 40% and dropping. Defensive batteries struggling to target ships that moved with the twitchy unpredictability of creatures running on pure instinct and fury. Evacuation protocol, he barked, already moving toward the fortified command center. Get all non-essential personnel to the core shelters, security teams to breach points, and someone get that human too. He stopped, remembering where the human was, standing in the formal audience chamber, which had exactly 0 protective features because nobody expected to need them in what was essentially a glorified conference room. Escort Unit Gamma. Extract the human immediately. Ulix commanded through the emergency channel. Priority Alpha. Get her to the core shelter before. The station shuddered as something large and explosive made contact with the outer hull. Somewhere metal screamed and atmosphere vented into space with the sound of the galaxy's worst whistle. Through the security feed, Ulix watched he who prevents bad things physically reach for the human, clearly intending to simply carry her to safety because that would be faster than waiting for her to navigate the corridors on those fragile legs. The human stepped back, just one step, but it was deliberate. I appreciate the concern, she said, her voice cutting through the klaxons with bizarre clarity. But I'll stay here. With respect, envoy, this is not a request, he who prevents bad things rumbled, his translator struggling to convey urgency without sounding threatening. You are in immediate danger. Your biological profile cannot withstand. I understand my biological profile just fine, the human interrupted. I'm staying. Ulix watched in disbelief as his trained security team professionals who'd extracted diplomats from active war zones hesitated. Something in the human's tone, perhaps, or the way she'd positioned herself near the chamber's central pillar with what almost looked like tactical awareness. Another impact, closer this time. The chamber's holographic displays flickered and died, plunging the space into emergency lighting that cast everything in shades of amber and shadow. Administrator Drefkith boarding parties detected on Deck 9. His assistant's panicked voice crackled through his neural link. They're cutting through the blast doors. Defensive teams are engaging. But the feed cut to static. Deck 9 was 2 levels above the audience chamber. Ulix made a decision that would either save lives or end his career. Gamma unit remain with the human. Defensive posture. All other security teams fall back to the core and establish a perimeter. We're sealing the outer sections. It was brutal calculus. Sacrifice the outer decks. Let the Draftkith think they were winning, and hold the core until reinforcements arrive. Anyone caught outside the perimeter would have to fend for themselves, including 6 Burlathi warriors, and 1 impossibly fragile human who'd refused evacuation. He who prevents bad things clearly reached the same conclusion. His team formed up around the human in a defensive configuration that would have made a military instructor weep with pride. Weapons charged, armor systems activated, every sensor pointed toward the chamber's entrance. The human, meanwhile, had moved to a position behind the central pillar. Not cowering, her posture was too controlled for that. She'd set down her data case and was doing something with her hands, fingers moving through a sequence that Ulix's database unhelpfully identified as stretching exercises. Envoy, he who prevents bad things, said carefully. When the hostiles breach this chamber, remain behind us. Do not engage. Do not run. Do not draw attention. We will handle. The doors exploded inward with a concussive blast that sent debris skittering across the polished floor. Draftkith poured through the opening like a flood of chitinous nightmares. 12 of them, maybe 15, hard to count when they moved like that. All twitching antennae and serrated limbs. They were smaller than the Burlathi but faster, and they'd clearly identified the guards as the primary threat. The audience chamber became a war zone. Energy weapons lit the space in strobing flashes. A Burlathi went down, his armor smoking from a direct hit to his center mass. Another pivoted and fired, taking 2 Draftkith apart in a spray of ichor and shattered carapace. The chamber filled with the sounds of combat weapons discharge. Alien battle cries. The crunch of exoskeletons collide. He who prevents bad things was magnificent, using his bulk to physically shield the space where the human had been. His weapon tracking targets with veteran precision. 3 Draftkith broke through the defensive line, skittering across the walls with adhesive limbs.
their trajectory aimed directly at the pillar. At the human. Ulix, watching through the flickering security feed, felt his secondary heart stop. The human moved. Not away, toward, and the station's sensors, which had been cataloging every energy signature in the chaos, suddenly registered something that made absolutely no sense. A spike. Massive, unprecedented, coming from the human's position. Not from a weapon. The signature was wrong for technology. It was biological, but the readings were climbing into ranges that shouldn't be possible for anything organic, anything living, anything that wasn't classified as a weapon itself. The numbers kept rising, and then every sensor in that section of the station overloaded simultaneously.
The security feeds came back online after 6 seconds of static, which doesn't sound like long until you're watching a member of a supposedly fragile species facing down 3 hostiles who could shred Duraplast with their mandibles. What Ulix saw made his primary brain convinced his secondary brain was malfunctioning. The Dravikith weren't moving, not in the carefully assessing their target way. They weren't moving in the deceased way either. They were suspended approximately 2 meters off the ground, limbs locked mid-strike, their entire bodies rigid as if someone had hit a cosmic pause button on just that portion of reality. The human stood beneath them, one hand extended, her expression carrying the concentrated focus of someone performing a complex mathematical equation in their head. Around her, the air itself looked wrong, distorted, like heat shimmer but colder, and the metal of the central pillar behind her was developing frost patterns that definitely hadn't been there 6 seconds ago. What in the name of the founders? Ulix breathed, which his translator unhelpfully rendered as confused chittering. The human's hand clenched into a fist. The 3 Dravikith crumpled. Not violently, there was no explosion, no visible force. They simply compacted, their exoskeletons folding inward with sounds like breaking ceramics, as if the space they occupied had suddenly decided to become much, much smaller. By the time they hit the floor, they were roughly the size of cargo crates, and approximately as threatening. The remaining Dravikith in the chamber froze, which was arguably the smartest decision they'd made all day. He who prevents bad things, to his credit, had his weapon trained on the new threat, because at this point basic pattern recognition suggested the human was definitely a threat to something. But his hands were shaking in a way that Berlothi hands generally didn't shake, unless confronting something that violated their understanding of physics. "Stand down," the human said, her voice directed at the surviving Dravikith. She wasn't even breathing hard. "Leave this station immediately, or I'll demonstrate what else humans can do when properly motivated." The Dravikith just turned and scrambled back through the destroyed doorway with the kind of speed that suggested their survival instincts had finally overridden their aggression instincts. The chamber fell silent except for the ambient klaxons, which chose that moment to shut off as station systems registered the hostile retreat. Emergency lighting flickered back to standard, illuminating a scene that looked like someone had rearranged reality's furniture without asking permission first. "Station command to escort Unit Gamma." Ulix's voice crackled through the comm, and he was impressed it came out steady. "Status report immediate." He who prevents bad things stared at the human for another 3 seconds, before remembering how to operate his translator. "Hostiles neutralized. Human envoy is. The human envoy is. I'm fine," the human supplied helpfully. She was brushing dust off her formal attire as if she'd merely stumbled, not just folded 3 living creatures into geometric improbability. A bit annoyed about the interrupted meeting, but physically fine. Ulix was already pulling up the sensor logs, his compound eyes scanning through data that made progressively less sense the more he read. His assistant floated nearby, bioluminescence flickering through colors that indicated extreme distress. "Administrator, the energy readings from the audience chamber are... they're not matching any known weapons signatures," the ephemeral said, its voice modulating in pitch with agitation. "The science team is requesting immediate clarification on what kind of device the human was carrying." "She wasn't carrying anything," Ulix said, watching the recordings again. The human's hands had been empty. No weapon, no device, no technology at all. Just her. "Pull up the biological scan we ran when she arrived. Cross-reference it with the energy signature from the incident." The holographic display populated with data that Ulix's brain initially refused to process. The energy signature, that massive reality-bending spike that had overloaded military-grade sensors, was biological in origin. It had emanated directly from the human cellular structure, specifically from locations the preliminary scan had flagged as metabolic centers. "That's not possible," his assistant stated flatly. "Biological organisms don't generate energy fields of that magnitude. The power requirements alone would cook the creature from the inside." "The thermal expenditure. Run it again," Ulix ordered. "Check for equipment malfunction, sensor spoofing, anything." 3 separate diagnostic cycles returned the same results. The energy had come from the human, all of it. "Get me the Earth contact database," Ulix said slowly. "Full biological survey, not the basic entry profile. I want everything we have on human physiology." What appeared on his display made him wish he'd retired last cycle, like his broodmate had suggested. Humans, according to the complete survey that apparently nobody had bothered to read thoroughly, were what happened when evolution got creative on a death world. Earth, classified as a Class 4 hazardous environment, had spent several billion years trying to kill everything on it, through creative combinations of climatic catastrophe, radiation exposure, atmospheric toxicity, predator saturation, and casual geological violence. The species that survived long enough to develop sapience had done so by becoming the most offensively over-engineered biological platforms the galaxy had ever produced. That single cardiovascular system the basic scan had flagged. It operated at pressures that would rupture the circulatory systems of most species. The limited natural armor. The epidermis was self-repairing, capable of adapting to different environmental stresses, and backed by an immune system so aggressive it occasionally attacked the body. It was protecting just for practice. The calcium-based skeletal structure could heal from catastrophic damage, and actually became denser under stress. The soft organs were redundant in ways the preliminary scan hadn't detected. Humans could survive with significant portions of their internal systems destroyed or removed. And the metabolic centers, those innocent-looking cells that every oxygen-breathing species had, were in humans apparently capable of something the database called adaptive energy liberation. Under stress conditions, human cellular structures could begin converting matter to energy at ratios that approached weaponized fusion reactions, all while keeping the host organism alive and functional. "They're walking reactors," Ulix's assistant whispered, its gaseous form contracting into a tight, alarmed sphere. "Those creatures are biological power plants that decided to develop consciousness." "Not exactly," Ulix corrected, reading further into the report with growing horror. "They're persistence predators, from a gravity-intensive environment, with atmospheric oxygen concentrations that would be toxic to most species. Their bodies are designed to chase prey until it dies from exhaustion, to survive injuries that would kill anything else, and to adapt to environmental conditions that..." He stopped, mandibles clicking in agitation. "We classified them as fragile. The preliminary scan was designed for normal species. Humans aren't normal. They're..." Ulix struggled to find an adequate comparison. "They're what happens when a planet spends eons trying to create the perfect survivor, and accidentally makes something that looks harmless." The formal inquiry began 4 hours after the Dravkith retreated to whatever hole they'd crawled from, and Ulix had spent every minute of those 4 hours watching security footage that his brain kept insisting was doctored. It wasn't. The science team had verified the recordings 17 times, each verification making them progressively more uncomfortable with the implication. The human sat in the inquiry chamber, now hastily relocated to a reinforced section of the station, with what Ulix absolutely wasn't calling containment protocols, looking exactly as harmless as she had when she'd first arrived. Same formal attire, same professional demeanor, same biometric readings that screamed fragile carbon-based life form to anyone who didn't know better. Ulix now knew better. He very much wished he did. "For the record," he began, trying to inject some formality into a situation that had left formality behind around the time the human had violated several laws of thermodynamics. "You are not under arrest or accusation. This is a clarification inquiry regarding the incident in Audience Chamber 7. I understand," the human said. Her tone carried the patience of someone who'd had this conversation before, which raised questions Ulix wasn't prepared to ask yet. "The energy readings from defensive response,"
exceeded anything in our threat database. The science team is still attempting to explain how you generated that level of output without, and I'm quoting directly here, immediately undergoing catastrophic thermal conversion into your constituent atom. The human's expression shifted into something that might have been amusement. Earth's first contact team mentioned that our biology tends to surprise people. I assumed that information had been properly distributed. The preliminary biometric scan classified your species as fragile. Yes, I noticed. There was definitely amusement now, though the translator was struggling to identify the specific emotional context. That's a common first assessment. The reality is more complicated. Clearly, Ulix gestured to the holographic display showing the frozen footage of 3 draft kits suspended in midair. Walk me through what happened. In terms my science team can understand without requiring psychiatric intervention afterward. The human considered for a moment, then began speaking in the tone of someone explaining a basic concept to particularly slow students. Humans evolved on a planet with higher gravity than standard, which required developing extremely efficient energy conversion at the cellular level. Our mitochondria, that's our primary metabolic organelle, don't just produce energy for normal biological functions. Under stress conditions, they can dramatically increase output by breaking down available matter at the molecular level. That's not biology. That's reactor technology. It's both, the human corrected. Earth's environment was hostile enough that anything surviving there needed redundancy and adaptability. Our cardiovascular system operates at high pressure to overcome gravity. Our skeletal structure is dense enough to support our mass in 0.98 gravity. Our nervous system processes threats and responds faster than most species register danger. And yes, our cells can produce energy levels that look excessive by galactic standards, because on Earth, excessive was baseline. Ulix felt his secondary hearts doing something complicated. The 3 draft kits, you compressed them using what? Exactly. Directed gravitational manipulation. She said it like she was describing how to open a door. Humans can consciously redirect our metabolic output into localized field generation. It's not common, most humans never train the ability, but it's standard curriculum for anyone in diplomatic or military position. We assumed the collective knew this. We didn't. That seems like an oversight in your intelligence gathering. The human tilted her head slightly, a gesture the database labeled as mild criticism. Earth submitted full biological documentation during first contact, medical specifications, evolutionary history, capability assessments. Someone was supposed to read those. Ulix pulled up the first contact files, and immediately saw the problem. The full documentation was there, all 7,000 pages of it, filed under supplementary species information, extended review pending. Nobody had read it. Nobody ever read the supplementary files, unless there was a specific reason to, and with hundreds of species applying for collective membership every cycle, the preliminary scans were considered sufficient for initial classification. The preliminary scans that had completely missed the fact that humans were essentially ambulatory weapons platforms, wrapped in deceptively soft packaging. Your species has been incorrectly classified, Ulix said, which qualified as the understatement of his career. We'll need to issue a comprehensive reclassification and distribute updated threat assessments to all collective stations and member species. Threat assessments, the human's tone sharpened slightly. We're not a threat, we're applicants for the colonial exchange program. You folded 3 armored hostiles into geometric impossibility, using nothing but biological processes. They attacked first, she pointed out reasonably. I defended myself and your station. That should count in Earth's favor for the application, shouldn't? Ulix's mandibles clicked in something between exasperation and grudging respect. The human had a point. She'd single-handedly repelled a hostile boarding action that had overwhelmed station security, and she'd done it without causing collateral damage to collective property. From a certain administrative perspective, that was exactly the kind of capability the colonial exchange program wanted in frontier settlers. From every other perspective, it was terrifying. The application process will require additional review, Ulix said carefully. We'll need updated biological specifications, capability assessments for typical human colonists, and clarification on exactly what other surprises your species might have that didn't make it into the preliminary documentation. The human retrieved her data case. Ulix now noticed she'd never actually dropped it during the fighting, and extracted a data chip. Earth's diplomatic corps prepared supplementary materials, in case the standard documentation proved insufficient. This includes capability demonstrations, training protocols, and recommendations for how to properly assess human colonists, without accidentally classifying them as non-threatening based on surface characteristics. She slid the chip across the table with a movement that looked entirely casual but probably could have launched it through the wall if she'd wanted. Ulix accepted it with mandibles that trembled slightly. This will be distributed to all relevant departments, with priority flag. Appreciated. The human stood, and Ulix's entire security detail tensed despite themselves. Does this mean Earth's application is still under consideration? Under extremely active consideration, Ulix confirmed. Though I suspect the approval process will be significantly faster now that we understand what we're approving. The human's expression shifted into something that the translator finally correctly identified as satisfaction. I'll report back to Earth that the demonstration was successful. Demonstration. Ulix's compound eyes widened. You planned for the Dravkith attack. No, but we anticipated that something would happen to require practical proof of human capability. The galaxy seems to have trouble believing documentation without visual confirmation. She moved toward the door, then paused. Administrator, a recommendation. When the next human delegation arrives, read the full biological documentation before making assumptions. It'll save everyone some surprises. Noted, Ulix said faintly. He watched her leave, escorted by Gamma Unit, who now maintained what might generously be called respectful distance rather than protective detail. The guards looked like they were escorting something dangerous while trying very hard to remain professional about it. His assistant floated closer once the human was gone, bioluminescence flickering through worried spectrum. Administrator, if humans have these capabilities, and they've been moving through collective space for 3 cycles now, how many other stations have encountered them and made the same classification error we did? Ulix pulled up the records, his dread mounting with each entry. 47 diplomatic stations had processed human envoys. 47 stations had run preliminary biometric scans. 47 stations had classified humans as fragile, harmless, and in need of protective protocol. 47 stations were currently operating under threat assessments that were catastrophically wrong. Issue a priority alert to all collective installations, Ulix ordered, already composing the message in his head. Species reclassification. Humans. Previous classification. Humans. Previous classification in new designation. He paused, considering. What exactly did you call a species that looked harmless but could manipulate gravitational fields with their biology? His assistant supplied helpfully. Apex survivor. Camouflaged predator. Cosmically inconvenient evolutionary accident. Approved for colonial exchange with full capability acknowledgement. Ulix decided. Let them establish their frontier settlements. Anyone foolish enough to attack a human colony will provide valuable data on exactly what humans can do when properly motivated. That seems ethically questionable. So is classifying walking reactors as fragile, Ulix pointed out. At least this way everyone's properly warned. He filed the report, attached the security footage, and added the supplementary documentation the human had provided. By tomorrow, every station in collective space would know that humans were not in fact delicate creatures requiring protection. They were something far more interesting and considerably more dangerous, wrapped in packaging that evolution had apparently designed specifically to make everyone else underestimate them. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Ulix wondered what other surprises humanity had waiting for the galaxy. Then he decided he didn't want to know, poured himself a strong beverage from his emergency diplomatic stress reserves, and spent the rest of the shift watching the footage of 3 Dravkith, learning the hard way that fragile was relative. The neutron star continued its rotation outside the station windows, indifferent to the minor recalibration of galactic understanding happening in its shadow. In the grand scheme of cosmic events, it was a small moment, One species revealing that appearances were deceiving. One administrator, learning to read the full documentation. But the Draftkith, fleeing through deeper space with their worldviews significantly adjusted, might have argued it felt rather larger from their perspective. The galaxy had just learned an important lesson about assumption. Humanity, meanwhile, was already planning where to build their first colonies, confident in the knowledge that everyone would read the documentation properly from now on. Probably,